Good morning, everybody. Lex webinar series enters 59th lecture of the series today. And so far, we have been inviting resource persons from various walks of the field of law. And without compromising on the topics and resource person, the webinar series is going on well, as you all know very well. Today, we have a very special resource person from Rajasthan High Court, Justice Dr. Pushpendra Singh Bharti. He was born in the year 1970 and he was practicing at Rajasthan High Court at Jaipur. And he did his BA, LLB, LLM in mercantile law and doctorate in law in the field of promotion and seniority in public employment, its changing dimensions and role of Supreme Court. And he enrolled in the year 1992 and he was elevated in the year 2016. His area of specialization includes civil side, writ jurisdiction, service and general miscellaneous both, revenue, election, mining, education, Panchayat Raj, criminal and miscellaneous matters, including public interest litigations. He practiced in Rajasthan High Court, Jaipur, Jodhpur, mainly in writ jurisdiction, spanning across service laws, public interest litigations, election, revenue, etc. He was the Additional Advocate General, Rajasthan High Court, Jodhpur from 13/10/2008 to 29/12/2008 and 6/1/2014 till his elevation to the High Court. He has remained as the panel lawyer for Kendriya Vidyalaya Sanghan, ONGC, Labour Department of Government Rajasthan, Ayurveda Department of Government Rajasthan, and represented the Reserve Bank of India, Jaina and Vyas University, Jodhpur, and many other bodies. He was a senior standing counsel for Indian Railways for more than 16 years. He was elected as member of the Bar Council of Rajasthan from 2009 to 2015. He was elected as president Rajasthan High Court Law Association in 2013, and he was general secretary Rajasthan High Court Association in 2001. He was a trained mediator of Rajasthan High Court. He was visiting faculty at his alma mater, Faculty of Law, J. Narayan Vyas University, Jodhpur for 19 years, from 1997 to 2016, and visiting faculty of National Law University, Jodhpur for a year. He is a member of Executive Committee of Indian Law Institute, Rajasthan Chapter, member, Supreme Court Bar Association since 1992. The credentials go on and on and on. He is not only academically very resourceful person, and his extracurricular activities is something very inspiring to all the advocates. He is an excellent horse rider. He's a swimmer. He's a shooter. He's a solo glider pilot. He's a parasailer. He has participated in many adventurous activities along with NCC and has A, B, and C certificates. And he has also participated in several national conferences and television debates and deliberated on myriad issues of importance for the administration of justice. He was Vice President of Students' Union Law Faculty, JMB University in 1990 to 1991. The list is very long, and with this warm introduction, we invite Dr. Justice Pushpendra Singh Bharti to deliberate today. Sir, the forum is yours. You are welcome.
Thank you so much, Srinivas Saab. You have been very generous in your introduction of mine, and Hemlata ji has been also very kind to give some leverage in the topics and all, and we have been discussing. And I was looking forward for this webinar, and I heard that your team is doing a great academic activity, and in these COVID times, this academic platform is a great pleasure to be in, because it is a time when all of us are not only facing the challenges in the society and in our legal fraternity, but it is also a time which is which needs to be constructively utilized by the younger lawyers, and the students, the law fraternity as at a large needs to utilize it for other purposes. If we, in every crisis there is an opportunity, it is often said, and therefore this is an opportunity which we have to grab at any cost, because if this kind of platform, when you make it meaningful, it is really very helpful for particularly for the younger lawyers, and I'm sure I will try to add on to your great spirit, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
directly coming to the CPC, CPC is a law. Unlike criminal law, we have separate procedural law in CRPC and substantive law in IPC. But in CPC, we have both together. So we have orders, sections, and we have rules in orders. It is a very vast topic, but we will try to consolidate it only for important topics from section 2 to section 21, so that we do it within our time frame. And those are really important topics because they are the core of the substantive law of civil law in the country. So it will be wonderful to discuss, question and answer, and also speak about it. So straight away I move on to a very important definition, which is the decree. The decree is the beginning. It so happens that the complete civil proceedings are, the three words are important. One thing is civil, another is a suit, and another is a decree. So words civil and suit as such are not defined in the CPC, but suit is basically a proceeding where the adjudication takes place of the rights of the parties, and civil is basically private rights which a party has and which the law need to redress. So decree definition, why it is important is that in normal terms, a lawyer may think decree, order, judgment, stay, everything, the terminology seems so general. But while understanding CPC, it is much required that we focus to the actual meaning of the concept, because decree has basically 5 essentials which are important to note that it is a decree. The 5 essentials are that the decree should be during adjudication. So I will also explain it. Adjudication means somewhere where the court is seized of the matter, the court is working on it, there is a matter before the court and a judicial process is going on. It cannot be an administrative process. I ask a question to myself as a student of law: can a university pass a decree, or can a municipal corporation pass a decree, or can a bank pass a decree? The answer would be that those are more of an administrative, financial, and other things. So we are basically, what we require is a system of justice to pass a decree, and the system of justice has to be undergoing an adjudication. It is not that tomorrow some issue is cropping up in the society and the court would suddenly pass a decree that no, on this issue, this is our feeling. No, it cannot be like that. It has to be firmly under the straitjacket formula of adjudication. So once this adjudication is going on, then the second essential part of the decree is the suit, because the suit is the basic proceeding which relates to that particular controversy in which the adjudication is being done. Otherwise, there are hundreds of adjudications that are happening. So it happens in that particular adjudication, and once it happens in the particular adjudication, then it is important that that adjudication gives us some kind of result. And the suit, which is the pleadings, which is the basic right and rights which are available to the parties. So suit is the consolidation of those pleadings. Now, the third essential part of the definition of decree is it has to be pertaining to the rights of the parties. You can't have an academic discussion in a suit or while doing an adjudication. So adjudication, then suit, and then rights. So the rights part is important because somebody has to have some right before the court. A person can't come in for an academic discussion before the court, or also for an answer which he may require for no reason. It cannot be fruit. The fruit may come or may not come, but the decree has to be pertaining to the rights and the right of the parties. It can be either parties. It can be plaintiff, it can be defendant. The decree can be of dismissal, the decree can be allowing some relief, it can be denying some relief, it can be permanently barring some relief. So basically, it has to be the rights which are being adjudicated. The parties put their rights before the court in the form of the suit, and the suit is adjudicated by the court, and the net result comes out as a decree, which is the outcome of the adjudication. The fourth component is that this has to be conclusive. This is very important because unless it is conclusive, it cannot happen. We can't have 2 decrees. We will come later on, we'll touch also preliminary decree and final decree, but actually there cannot be number of decrees in a suit. So decree has to be 1. And if this is 1 decree, then it has to have a tinge of finality. It has to have an element of finality. It has to have the parameter of conclusiveness, because a court, when the parties are contesting, then it is not open for the courts to be generalized. It cannot be generalized. It has to be conclusive. The court, after adjudication, after the rights are before the court, after the suit is there, there has to be a conclusive outcome. This conclusive outcome, it doesn't matter whose favor it comes, but those rights have to be conclusively determined, because those parties who are contesting those private rights need to know from the court that what is the final result, and the whole controversy has to come to rest. If the controversy comes to rest, then the actual purpose of the system of justice seems does get served. So, and the fifth and not the least, it has to be a formal expression. The decree cannot be an informal expression. Because suppose a judge and a lawyer are having a dialogue in the court, and suppose some observations are made by the lawyer and the judge during the course of the transaction or during the course of the adjudication, then all those transactions may not lead to a decree or an order, because it has to be a formal expression. The court has to write it down, the court has to give its reasons. Of course, the reasons come in judgment, but then decree has to be formal. It has to be drawn in a particular format. It has to have that sanctity of a written document, of which when the certified copies are given, it will culminate into the right to being answered by the respective parties. So these are the 5 elements which give the which sort of define the decree, where every decree which is attained finality, it is appealable, and therefore this is also becomes a parameter to see whether it is appealable, because we have seen in section 96 that it is a very broad. In appeal, when we talk, we say every decree is appealable, even so much so that if it is an ex parte decree, then also it is appealable. So therefore the decree has to be appealable. When we see the definition of decree, we automatically get the definition of order also, because again, in general terms, order seems to be a very vague term, but here we mean by order is that it has all the elements of a decree. When we understand the order, it has all the elements of a decree, but for the conclusiveness, because the order is also adjudicating, it is also upon the rights, it is in the suit, it is formal expression, but for the conclusiveness. So this one component of conclusiveness goes away, but it is not a one component alone, because there might be 100 orders. The moment conclusiveness goes away, that means during adjudication, it may be 1 order, 2 order, adjournments, filing reply, opportunities, applications, amendments, summary dismissal applications, evidence, etc., etc. So we all know, as law fraternity, as students of law, we have often discussed that this conclusiveness, this conclusive element, it gives a pure separation to decree and order, and orders may be many. And we all know that it is not our topic today, but we all know that all orders are not appealable. There are only few orders, like temporary injunction and all, which attain finality and which have final consequences. All those orders are appealable. So this is also becomes a cause of distinction between decree and order. And judgment, of course, we all know that judgment is the reasoning given by the court, including the factual matrix, which is the foundation to reach at the conclusion, and the conclusion in the shape of decree is there. So judgment has to precede the decree. And once the judgment is there, the court is able to explain that what was the summary of the whole proceedings, and after that, what were the reasons why court has arrived at those conclusions in which issues are dealt with, and the final conclusion is drawn, and then the final outcome comes in the shape of decree. There are so many. So this is the definition which we, as a student of law, we all need to ponder every time, because it gives us the dimension. There are other definitions like public officer, court, judgment, foreign judgment, and other definitions which are only one-line definitions. All of us understand what is court, what is public officer, what is so those are, except of course, mean profit is also one definition which needs a bit consideration. And the mean profit, the only reason why it needs consideration for a student of law is, we as lawyers, judges, teachers, everybody who's associated with the fraternity, the only reason is that often the word profit, it is taken as in its literal meaning, whereas profit has no consequence in while determination of mean profit. Mean profit is in fact an aspect to compensate the person, but it is basically the prevailing rent or the prevailing market rate of that particular area or those particular premises, and it has actually got nothing to do with the profit. So this is the only thing which we need to understand, and so these definitions are easy. I straight away move on to the next topic, which is very interesting. I will speak about, we will also discuss something about jurisdiction, because jurisdiction will be important in first few sections. And also it will again come back into picture when we come back to section 15. So jurisdiction we broadly understand. What broadly we understand is that, before coming to jurisdiction, sorry. For completing decree, it is necessary for us to know that decree are of two types. One is preliminary decree, another is final decree. Some of the jurisprudence also relates to part preliminary and part final decree. So when we understand decree, the concept has to be complete. Sorry, we need to come back to that. And therefore, part decree is one. We have understood that decree, there cannot be two decrees in a suit. So how do we do when the controversy needs to be decided in stages? Then the lawyer and the court define the stage. Once the stage is reached where we have arrived at all the 5 necessary elements, then the first decree comes, which we call it preliminary decree. A easy example of it would be a suit where it is relating to possession of property. So once the possession of the property has to be conclusively decided, adjudicated, determined, once it is decided, then the court may go into the next stage, that is deciding mean profit. So mean profit would be a final decree, and possession itself, which is the basic right, gives us the meaning of the decree, the preliminary decree. We can also take an example of part preliminary, part final by saying that part preliminary, in fact, remains the most intact and the most core part of the adjudication, because it is virtually, it has decided the controversy, but some components remain, and therefore the court leaves the case open, and those parts need to be decided, and those are decided by the court. So in case the court decides the possession, we can also take the example of, say, dissolution of partnership. So it has to be dissolved. Once it is dissolved, then what share will go to whom, it can be decided subsequently in a final decree. But preliminary, first court has to decide that what is, suppose there are 3 partners, so what would be the share, how it will be dissolved, what is the, so the basics and the nitty-gritties shall be decided. Once they are decided, then the court can move on to pass a final decree. And part preliminary and part final would be something like deciding the possession suit, but making an inquiry regarding the mean profits. So it will be part preliminary, part final, and then after the order of inquiry is made. Why it needs to be called part preliminary, part final is because we have already passed our preliminary decree as a system of justice. Then we are between the finality and the preliminary decree. So it is part preliminary, part final. We decide it, we investigate, the system investigates, and once the order of investigation for the mean profit is passed, it becomes part preliminary, part final. These are very simple examples to understand the nitty-gritties of this. And then we, of course, we can move on to the next topic. The next topic is the section. So sorry, we'll first speak about something. We'll discuss something about jurisdiction. So broadly, friends, jurisdiction is something which goes to the core of the controversy. Even if it is not on merits, then also jurisdiction is derived from merit. So while studying the jurisdiction, the first jurisdiction which comes to the mind, in the mind of a student of law, is the territorial jurisdiction. Now in criminal law, we have police stations which have local jurisdiction of a particular area. Similarly, in civil law, we have civil magistrate, or the lowest pedestal of the judiciary, which are having certain jurisdictions. Then we have district courts which have district level jurisdiction. Then we have high courts that have state level jurisdictions. Then we have Supreme Court which have the countrywide jurisdiction. And these are basically jurisdictions which are territorial jurisdictions based on a territory. So suppose a movable, immovable, or tort, or any kind of rights infringement arises, and it is situated in a particular territory, then the consequence of territorial jurisdiction has to come in, because it is a immovable property. Then invariably it has to go to the territorial jurisdiction. So suppose somebody is in Delhi, or somebody is in Bangalore, or somebody is in Trivandrum, Then as far as immovable property is concerned, the territorial jurisdiction gains significance. And even for movable property also, then also the territorial jurisdiction remains important, because there is a component of where the respondent resides. So again, territory comes in. So territorial jurisdiction remains an important jurisdiction. Broader distinction can also be made between civil and criminal jurisdiction. We all know it, that civil and private rights are different, and criminal law is for punishment, and this is for the adjudication process of civil is to get compensation or get the right itself restored. So this is the broader classification which we can go in. Then from territorial jurisdiction, we go to the subject jurisdiction. All of us know these days this is an era of specialization. We all know that we have subject jurisdiction. We all in our courts, we see consumer courts, we see family courts, we see industrial courts, we see labor courts, we see administrative tribunals. So these are all subject-based courts and motor accident claim tribunals. So these are subject-based tribunals and subject-based courts, where the subject territorial jurisdiction comes into play, and it plays a vital role, because subject jurisdiction again bifurcates the jurisdiction of a particular place. Even if it is a territorial jurisdiction, then also subject jurisdiction within territorial jurisdiction gains a lot of significance when we are trying to, suppose a client comes to a young lawyer, then the young lawyer, while deciding that where he will fight the case, the first thing he has to answer is that in which court he has to go to file the case. Because then he has to start framing the controversy and the relief and the grounds and everything. But first of all, he has to decide that where he will go, whether he'll go, if it is a consumer right, he will go to the consumer court. If it is an accident, he will go to the motor accident claim. If he will go to if he has an industrial dispute, so respectively, or if it is a divorce case or a custody case, then he will go to the family court. So the subject matter is a very significant while the jurisdiction is decided. And a student of law has to be very clear in his mind when he is taking care of jurisdiction, because that gives him that core confidence at the initial stage to go ahead and do with it. So this is subject to territorial jurisdiction. Then we also see original jurisdiction and appellate jurisdiction. Now, original jurisdiction, friends, is something which we all know. They're the basic court where we go for our jurisdiction. And appellate jurisdiction, of course, is the next remedy that we have in CPC, and for which we go to the higher court as stipulated and as there in the CPC itself. Apart from these jurisdictions, we have also pecuniary jurisdiction, which is important to know. Pecuniary jurisdiction was more prevalent. We all remember that even Supreme Court had in 60s, it had pecuniary jurisdiction. So pecuniary jurisdiction, but is still relevant. Suppose a magistrate has a power to deal with cases up to rupees 5,000 or up to rupees 10,000, or a particular court goes to deal with a case up to a particular limit, pecuniary limit. So pecuniary limit is based upon the nature of the court, nature of the relief claim. Once the pecuniary limits are there, then it has to be strictly adhered to. And once they are adhered to, then it also gives a deep insight to us for this. One point here, which I always want to discuss amongst the fraternity, is that a question comes to a student of law, that whether a jurisdiction can be created, whether two parties can by consent create jurisdiction. Suppose a plaintiff comes to you and defendant come to you, and he says that me and defendant are on same page. We both want the matter to be done in Mumbai. So can a jurisdiction in a civil dispute be created with the convenience of the parties or will of the parties? The simple understanding to this is, the simple answer to this is no jurisdiction can ever be created by the parties, lawyers, or courts. It has to be there or it is not there. It has to be there or it is not there. The answer is very simple. No creation of jurisdiction. Please do not have any doubts on this. There can never be a creation of jurisdiction. But the disclaimer is that if there are multiple jurisdictions, suppose a person by virtue of jurisdiction has jurisdiction in Chennai, Mumbai, and Trivandrum, then he certainly can choose jurisdiction. He cannot create jurisdiction, but he can choose jurisdiction. Please understand that there is a huge difference between choosing jurisdiction and creating jurisdiction. If you create jurisdiction, then it is not possible. If you choose jurisdiction, it is possible. The parties can choose their jurisdiction or go ahead in one of the jurisdictions. If there are multiple jurisdictions, as we will see later on when we understand place of suing, then we'll understand that one of those things can be chosen by us. And once we, suppose a Maruti company has its plants in has a production plant in Gurgaon, and the Maruti agency is selling Maruti car in Chennai. Then the agency is selling to a customer. Then the agency also has having equal responsibility as per the terms and conditions. So whether to choose Chennai or to Gurgaon, where the actual production is happening, it is for the parties to concern. But there is one more element which we all have to be very careful is that suppose the Maruti company is selling you this, selling the client this product, and there is in the selling conditions itself, it stipulates subject to Gurgaon jurisdiction only. It can certainly do that. And once you pay the receipt and pay the amount, you are sort of closing that issue and you are agreeing to the jurisdiction. And once as a consumer, we agree to a particular jurisdiction, then we need to abide by it. The Maruti company cannot tell us that this thing is subject to Calcutta jurisdiction only, because there is no production in Calcutta, and the agency itself where the purchase has been made is in Chennai. So the company cannot create jurisdiction, but it can choose jurisdiction, and once it chooses and the consumer agrees or the customer agrees, then that has to be very firmly followed. Then it cannot be then the Honorable Apex Court is very clear. Once it is chosen, then it has to be that jurisdiction. Otherwise, the jurisdiction can be chosen between the parties. So these are basic issues regarding jurisdiction. Section 9 is a wonderful section because it goes to the core of the law. It is a section which I, as a student of law, have admired for last 30 years. Why I have admired it is because that it it gets its strength from ibu jus ibi remedium. Wherever there is a right, there is a remedy. There has to be a remedy. So this, whenever friends, we see any law, then ubi jus ibi remedium is not there, because any law has every law has a definition. Whenever you go to motor accident claim tribunal, you will have a definition of motor, you have a definition of machine, you have a definition of accident, and you have a definition by your consumer, you have a definition of consumer. Family, you have a definition. So everywhere the jurisdiction or the subject is defined. Section 9 gives that sky is the limit, that parameter to the CPC, where it says that except for rights which are expressly and impliedly barred. We all know what express and implied barred means. And if there is a statute, say if there is a statute which debars the CPC from taking it up as a suit, then it is up to the then if it is a express barred, then we have to choose that particular remedy as lawyers or as law fraternity for our clientele. And if the remedy is then if the remedy is specifically available, we have to go there. If it is expressly or impliedly barred, we have to go there. But if it is not barred, or if there is any dispute in the jurisdiction, we can definitely put it before the civil court, and civil court itself will have power to decide as to what would be the nature, whether the jurisdiction is there or not, whether there is an express or implied. But it is expected from the court that if there is an express bar or an implied bar, then the court need not go into it. Simultaneously, while reading Section 9, we have to be very careful that it only decides. It is basically meant for private rights. It is not meant for religious rights, or it is not meant for caste rights, or it is not meant for honorable rights, or it is not meant for political rights. We may have separate law for political rights. We have People's Representation Act. We have our local laws in every local body and everything. But remember, friends, that technically, when we are focusing on Section 9, it basically comes to private rights. So suppose a person says that I want to follow religion Hindu, and I want to marry by adhering to the norms of Muslim religion or Christian religion, then no suit or no civil right, because it is not a civil right, it is a religious right. Practice what he wants. If I say that I am an Hindu and I say I want to pray to Lord Ganesha or Lord Vishnu, then nobody can come and say, no, you have to pray only to Lord Balaji. So it is a personal choice. So similarly in caste, if I say that I belong to a particular caste and these are the particular things, if somebody says you are violating the norms of the caste, then it is not a pure civil question. Similarly, if somebody changes from Congress to BJP or BJP to Congress or to Communist Party or to any other party, then it is a question of electoral or election laws. It is not a pure question of civil law. Again, if somebody comes and say, give me Padma Bhushan, I have written 5 books and I am a very literate person and I am a lawyer who has never been defeated in the courts of law and I am a great thing. You can't have it as a civil right. You can't have it as a private right. These are few examples which I have given to the audience so that we can understand that these are the basically we may have. But simultaneously, if there is a temple and somebody has a trust, is holding a position of trust and is mismanaging the temple or is trying to take away the funds from the temple, then a civil right will come in. Then it is a private right, then it is a civil right. Then the right to suit, right to take up civil proceedings would be available for us. But unless it is, if it is a pure question of belief, pure question of caste, pure question of this thing, then we have to find remedies elsewhere rather than pure civil remedy or pure civil suit. Section 10 and 11 are those sections which go beyond CPC. If you see Roman laws, Greek laws, Indus Valley, even our old civilizations, even our king's laws and all laws, even if you go to those extent, then also we will find that there was an aspect of res judicata and res sub judice available in the law. These, when we read res sub judice and res judicata, then we realize that whether we are a trial court lawyer, we are a Supreme Court lawyer, or we are a High Court lawyer, or we practicing any forum in this country or any other country, we can't do with the basic aspects and the specialized aspects of doctrines of law like res judicata. The significance of res judicata and res sub judice is that no process of law, no process of justice can be completed without understanding what is res judicata. The Honorable Apex Court in few of the cases in 60s and 70s went on to say that even when CPC is not applicable on the writ jurisdiction and other jurisdictions, then also res judicata will be applicable on all jurisdictions, including industrial tribunals, including all other aspects, judicial forums where the necessity of CPC may not be there. It is another thing that CPC as core law will always have its significance, because whenever you need procedure, suppose in High Court I need a summon to be served or a notice to be served, I have to again fall back to the CPC. So in procedure as well as in substantive law, a student of law will always have to have deep understanding of CPC and CRPC to have and of course Evidence Act, to have the core of to go to the core of any law. So coming back to the topic, res sub judice and res judicata are basically avoidance of multiple litigation on the same issue between the same parties. So if one suit is going on, then on the same topic between the same parties, if another suit is filed, then it has to be stayed. The previous suit will continue and the subsequent suit has to be stayed. Similarly, if one suit is decided and another suit is filed, then the next suit has to be dismissed. So staying part is res sub judice and the dismissal part is res judicata. So the essentials is that the parties should be same. Apart from the parties, the rights also should be same. It has to be before a proper jurisdiction. Suppose one suit is going on in an improper jurisdiction and another is going on in a proper jurisdiction, then we cannot in any case take the plea of res sub judice or res judicata. It has to be in the proper jurisdiction within the country. Suppose some suit is going on regarding the same controversy in some other country, then normally, though res judicata we can plead before the court, but strictly it may not apply and the court may ignore it, saying that we are in the competent jurisdiction in the country and so we can carry on. So res sub judice and res judicata, these are basically regarding there has to be 2 suits, there has to be 2 or more suits, because otherwise res sub judice, res judicata will not come. And multiplicity has to be avoided. Otherwise, there are chances that there will be conflict of law. And because if suppose today I go to a market and I purchase a mobile phone for myself, if I'm not satisfied with the services of the mobile phone or a computer or whatever I'm purchasing, I can buy a new one. I can upgrade it. I can purchase new. I can get it fixed. I can get more. Get more GBs. I can get more space. I can get more power. I can get more batteries. I can get more softwares. I can get more apps downloaded in it. But friends, we have to realize that judgment is not like that. We can't. It is not a purchasable community. That is why we are all serving in the temple of justice in our respective capacities. And here the significance of the res judicata comes in, that if suppose it is a human instinct, please understand that not as a lawyer, but understand it as a human. It is a human instinct that a person does not normally get satisfied. So the client who will come to you will say that I need a better judgment. So you not because you are a good lawyer or you could not understand res judicata, but because your client is demanding, there might be a tendency, or he will go to another lawyer and say, I need a better judgment. But if the lawyer tells him that on the same issue, we cannot have a second judgment because res judicata is a very strong doctrine, then he will understand, and then he will stay satisfied at his home. And then he will try to pacify himself that this is the fate of the controversy, which has to be conclusive. If it is not conclusive, the whole judicial system might crumble, and we as fraternity might suffer damages which will be irreparable. So this is what is important. There has to be the essentials are, it has to be two suits. The issue has to be same. The parties have to be same. They have to be in the country. Competent jurisdiction has to be same. So this is how it goes on, and we have to be very careful about it. And we cannot compromise on the doctrine of res judicata. We also, when we as students of law, we see that we also relate to res judicata being read in consonance with estoppel and other doctrines, and also lis pendens and so on and so. So these, like estoppel also debars some. If some stand is taken, you can't go back. So some court and some system is taking some stand and you can't go back. So res judicata gains that significance. As far as the explanations part of the res judicata is concerned, we just touch it in a few minutes because our time is coming to an end and we have this one more topic to go. The explanation is firstly that the former and prior. So the former in res sub judicis, which is the prior in the res sub judicis, which is lodged first, the case which is lodged first. The prior in res judicata is which is decided first. So this is a slight difference which comes in the explanation. Then we have appeal is separate, because if a person has to file an appeal this is basically parallel. Res judicata doctrine applies to parallel courts. It doesn't apply to superior courts because a person always have a right of taking the same controversy to an appellate court. And the issue once we are dealing with res judicata, it is to be finally decided. If it has been adjudicated and decided, then only res judicata will operate. We have that issue has to be direct and substantial. It cannot be something where it cannot be vague. If some issue is there, it can be direct and substantial. Here, while we are learning the process of explanation 4 of this section 11, we understand that also a concept of constructive res judicata comes in. Constructive res judicata is those issues which need to have been taken and are not taken shall have to be considered as having been taken. Although it is there in orders also, but this explanation 4 also gives us something about the constructive res judicata. Then we also understand while in explanation 5 that if something was asked for, suppose I ask for 5 reliefs and 2 have been given, then all 3 have been denied. So it cannot be said that you have not said anything about 3 reliefs, or res judicata will not apply. So this constructive res judicata as well as explanation 5, these are meant to contain the persons from multiplicity of litigation. Then we have extended by explanation 6, we have extended the res judicata to public interest litigation and public causes also. Suppose a society, a colony, all colony members fight for a particular cause and the cause goes away, or particular order is passed, then it is binding on the all society members or all community members. You cannot say that yesterday house number 1 to 5 filed the same litigation, today house number 10 to 20 are filed, and tomorrow 30 to 40. You can't say that. Otherwise, it will be all chaos would be there. So it has been extended by this explanation. Res judicata has been extended to public causes and public interest also. The execution was earlier not there. Now execution proceedings also are there as a part of the res judicata doctrine. The limited jurisdiction, if it is there in the last explanation, it is always once the court's jurisdiction changes, it doesn't, the concept of application of res judicata will not change. It will stay as it is. So this is the three major reasons which we understand as student of law is that no person should be vexed for the same cause twice. It has to attain finality. It has to attain conclusiveness. It has to come to an ending. A person has to be satisfied that today I have got this property or I have not got this property. So this has to, once he has come to the court, there should be a definite answer. He should not be vexed. Otherwise, today he says, today I am doing one senior advocate, tomorrow I will bring more senior advocates. So he will be vexed many times, and that will not be. Then it is in the interest of the state, because the state has a duty to maintain the law and order. As per the constitution, it is the duty of the governance. So the governance and the state would fail if already we have 3.5 crore matters which are about which are pending. Suppose, for example, just for on the lighter side, if everybody is permitted to have 3 or 4 litigations on a particular topic, immediately we'll have 15 crore matters pending on the single day itself. So this will be the change that we might face on the lighter side, of course, to understand the concept that why multiplicity is not required. Then it is also in the judicial respect has to be there. Otherwise, it will not be a temple of justice, but it will be a mall where we can get a better mobile phone each time we go in. With more money, we can bring in a better thing. Here, it is not about more money. It is not about better chances. It is not about better lawyers. It is not about better courts. It is not about judges. It is only about a right which is being conclusively determined from where we started today. The last topic of the day which we have is, we also have one foreign judgment small topic. So foreign judgment is very simple, because foreign judgment is that there are only 6 conditions which we all read that they have to be served. The concept of foreign judgment basically is we have to read it and understand it out of the box also, because the basic law says that if it is contrary to if it is fraudulent, then we will not accept it. If it is against the Indian law, we will not accept it. If it is against the international law, we will not accept it. If it is not on merits, suppose parameters of natural justice have not been followed, we will not accept it. And if it is not having a competent jurisdiction, then we will not. So what is the explanation to this? Natural justice, suppose some American court or XYZ Pakistani court or Bangladesh court, without giving any opportunity of hearing, decides the matter. We will not accept it because it is against the public policy. If somebody passes a punishment that hands have to be chopped off or fingers have to be chopped off, we will not agree to adhere to those judgments, because of course it is not pertaining to criminal law, but still giving an example or something where there is a conflict between international law and the national law. There might be, for some civil things also, there might be punishments like whipping or something. We will not agree to that, because it has to be under the public policy. It has to adhere to the basic international law and basic Indian laws. Fraudulent we cannot accept. Ex parte we should not accept. So these are the parameters. Otherwise we want to respect, but a lawyer must always know, a student of law must always know that what kind of relationship we are having with that country. It always plays in the mind of the country, and what kind of reciprocal treatment they are giving to our judgments. It is an unsaid rule that reciprocability gives a lot of significance. Suppose some country is rubbishing and throwing our judgments to the dogs. We cannot as an international community blindly accept their judgments. We are not against anyone, but simultaneously we safeguard the dignity of our own laws, the dignity of our own country, and also the dignity of the international law. These are to be safeguarded. It is a larger perspective. These days, when there is a lot of interaction between the international community, we can't isolate ourselves and say that if husband and wife are staying in London, then they have a divorce decree or a maintenance decree or a custodial decree from there, and we will not adhere to it. But because they have voluntarily gone there and taken their decree from there, we should adhere to that. There is no reason why we do not adhere to that. And similarly, in other cases, not only in custodial matters, there are business transactions, there are partnerships, there are global economic expansion has led us to a place where we are having, across the country, we are having our legal rights and things like that. So we have to adhere to foreign judgment thing. Today, it is meaningful for a student of law to carefully understand that what will be the circumstances in which we will adhere to it and we may not adhere to it. Coming straight away to the last topic, that is the place of suing. The place of suing is significant because once we decide, as we were talking about, it is again correlated to the jurisdiction. The parameters of jurisdiction we have understood. Broadly, we said we discussed territorial, subject, and territorial jurisdiction, subject jurisdiction, and also pecuniary jurisdiction. But criminal, civil, appellate, so many. But here, for the purpose of place of suing, it will be important to focus on territorial, subject, and pecuniary jurisdiction. So territorial jurisdiction, if a person is having, if a particular cause is having, then territorial jurisdiction has to be restricted to that. Apart from this, when we understand section 15, it is simple one-line section which says you have to start from the lowest court. What do we mean? There are two things which are important. One thing is that it is a system of justice. We as students of law, we all realize that it's a system of justice, that the justice need to go to the doorstep of the citizen. So to take it to the doorstep, you have to begin with the lowest court, because the lowest number of lowest courts have been established in such a manner that they are there in the smaller places. High court will be there only in Chennai, but then you will have so many districts, you will have so many talukas, you may have so many tehsils, so many things. So you need to reach out. So that is why the philosophy of law behind section 15 is that you need to reach out to the last citizen, to the man who is isolated, to the man who is there not in the mainstream urban centers. Even to the last corner, we want to take the justice to the doorstep. Therefore, we are taking it to the lowest court. Another reason is there has to be a pyramid. If every cause comes to the Supreme Court because it is a territorial jurisdiction of the complete country, the system of justice will collapse. The system of justice will go away. It will vanish because Supreme Court cannot handle crores of cases. And then the whole system will be disturbed. So we begin with there. Most of the people get satisfied there. Those who don't get satisfied, those who are not satisfied, always have a remedy of go. The remedy keeps on moving, and it moves in a shape of pyramid, so that the structure of justice, the structure of system of justice for a lawyer, for a judge, for a student of law, it remains defined. So section 15 is very elementary, but very important. So we have to adhere to it. And then section 16, 17, and 18 are pertaining to immovable properties. So almost you can turn a blind eye towards these provisions of law by saying that immovable property you have to go, whether it is mortgage, it is sale, it is partition. Immovable property you have to go where immovable property is. Only difference is that if it is a single property, then you define property, then it is under 16. If it is in multiple jurisdictions, sometimes it happens. Suppose there are two districts, and your client comes to you and says that my field or my agricultural field is falling in both districts. So by virtue of section 17, you can go in either of the districts and choose your jurisdiction. Similarly, in 18, if there are multiple jurisdictions, because we have to appreciate, then when we travel, we see that there is a board. This district comes to end. Chennai welcomes you. Now another district, Madurai welcomes you. Now this another. So every place there is a definition of territory. So those, if some property, immovable property lies in multiple territories, then we can go to one of the courts, one of the territories, and tell the court that this is the reason why I'm here. This is the real reason why I find that it is this kind of jurisdiction. You have to go by it. So 16, 17, and 18 are as simple as that. As far as 19 and 20 are concerned, they are about law of compensation, law of tort, and all other reliefs in 20, where also the rule is very simple. Where the cause of action arises, we all know cause of action we have to study. When a client comes to us or a problem comes to us, we first of all see what is the cause of action. Once we see the cause of action, then it is open for us to find out that once out of the cause of action where the jurisdiction arises. And simultaneously, we can also look for where the respondent is residing. Where the respondent is residing, we can choose the jurisdiction there. And this will also create two multiple jurisdictions, but we can choose one of them, wherever we require. Now, one thing is important is we have to understand section 21, that when the jurisdiction, how much error a lack of jurisdiction can cause. This is again very important, because the lack of jurisdiction can be wholly erroneous, or we can tolerate it. So what are the tolerable levels, and what is the wholesome level? For this, when we go, we have to understand that first of all, jurisdictional objections have to be taken at the first instance, at the initial stage of the proceedings, and also there has to be a injustice caused because of the jurisdictional error, then only there needs to be an intervention. Now, suppose, for example, we have District 1, District 2, and District 3. Suppose a suit, suppose some X suit gets decided by District 1 or District 2 or District 3. Then this is territorial jurisdiction. Now, our district judge is common for all these three because they are all from the same cadre, they are all from the same seniority, they are all from the same system. It is decided by A district judge, B district judge, or C, it doesn't matter. Law does not recognize that kind of distinction between the judges and the districts. So if at all some error happens due to territorial jurisdiction, then the law has power to overlook it. Normally it will not. If some objection is taken at the first instance, the territorial jurisdiction will be strongly implemented. But in case there is an overlooking or there is a mistake, then the mistake of territorial jurisdiction will not nullify the decree on merits, because the decree has been given by a competent court of the same level of jurisdiction with the same level of competence. The same level of competence and same level of judicial maturity, same district level. So these three district judges in three different districts, either of them decides it and we abide by it, because territorial jurisdiction is not damaging to the right of a person beyond a point, but it has to be also adhered to. Same is the case with the pecuniary jurisdiction. Same is the case with most of the other types of jurisdiction. But there is a caveat here. We have to be very strict in the case of subject jurisdiction. It will be a nullity if subject jurisdiction is violated. Because subject jurisdiction, suppose a consumer goes to motor accident claim and decides to have a claim there, he cannot have it. He cannot have it because consumer has to go in consumer court only. If subject jurisdiction, if a decree is passed in his favor in motor accident claim, or in an administrative tribunal, or in an industrial tribunal, or in a family court, or if a motor accident claim passes a divorce decree, then even if it is overlooked, even if it is nullity at inception, it is a nullity. It is not voidable. It is a void ab initio. If it is subject matter and it has been, if the subject matter has been violated, subject jurisdiction, it is void ab initio. 21A was incorporated to see that for execution proceedings, no separate suit is required. Even if a foreign court execution is there, then also we can execute it in the same proceedings, in execution proceedings. We need not file a separate suit. This was broad core substantive law, which is elementary for all of us as students of law. I would also, I hope Srinivas ji will agree that I have maintained the time limit, though it was slightly.
Exactly, sir.
And we can immediately go to question answers.
Yes, sir. I have received a question in the chat box privately.
Yes.
Shall I ask the question, read out the question on page behalf?
Please, it will be good,
Yes,
so
sir.
that all can hear and hear the answer also.
Yes, sir. The first question relates to rejection of plaint.
Yes.
The question says that an order rejecting plaint is a decree under section 2 CPC.
Yes.
An order refusing to reject a plaint in an application filed by the party, whether it's a decree or it is only an order in the nature.
Again, we have to apply that simple principle, friend. We have to apply whether it is, again, adjudication, formal expression, and conclusivity in a suit. So whether it is conclusive, we all understand it is not conclusive, so it is an order.
It's not a decree at all. Unless it is an order rejecting plaint, it is not a decree.
Unless it is giving finality.
Finality.
Finality. That is why when that is why we took 5 parameters. All 5 have to be there together. If it is not a suit, it will not be a decree. If it is not a adjudication, not a decree. If it is not remedying the rights, not a decree. If it is not between the parties, not a decree. And formal expression nahi hai, then also it will not be decree. And not last, but not least, if it is not conclusive, then it will not be decree.
The conclusion decides whether there is a decree or not.
Pardon?
Conclusion decides the question of naming as a decree.
Yes. Otherwise, it will become an order.
An order. Yes, sir. Next question relates to res judicata section 9. For example, in Tamil Nadu, we have an act called the Public Property Damages Act. Any property, including private property, is damaged in a procession or some other meeting, the person who caused it damage is liable to pay the compensation to the owner of the property. So where there is a specific provision for claiming damages for filing a proceeding under a special act. They have named the authorities, they have given the formula, they have also given the procedure to follow in the matter of getting compensation. But there is no bar of filing a civil suit in the PPD Act. That's called Public Property Damage. My question, the questioner asks is whether a civil suit filed by a person whose property is damaged under Order 7 Rule 1 is barred because of alternative provision available for claiming compensation under the Special Act, though there is no bar of jurisdiction under the Special Act.
This is a very interesting question.
Yes, sir.
See, the question is that civil court itself, as I said, the question itself is that whether the bar is expressly impliedly available to us. If we are not, if as a lawyer we are not able to say that there might be an express or implied bar, then we can definitely put a thrust before the court that please court decide the jurisdiction. We can make a thrust that you have to decide, because jurisdiction has to be decided by civil court. But since in the question asked, since there is an express bar means that particular issue has been provided with an express remedy.
Yes, sir.
Then normally the court should not go into it unless a person is able to convince that I have questions of law to be decided and rights and remedies to be decided which are beyond that law. So beyond that, suppose law says that we will decide all compensation of below 20,000, and you have a compensation of 2 lakh rupees.
2 lakh.
Then you can certainly say that it is not an express bar. You can go back. But otherwise, suppose tomorrow in a motor accident claim, it is in a similar example. If a person says I'll file a civil suit for compensation, normally he cannot. He should not.
He cannot.
So that is why when there is an express and implied bar, normally it should not.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Next question arises out of section 10 CPC, sir. The questioner wants to know, consolidation of suit is a new word used by many of the courts, including the Supreme Court, that has not been defined anywhere in the CPC. So consolidation of suit can be an alternative for section 10 CPC. Instead of staying a suit, what is wrong in consolidation of suits?
You are absolutely right, my friend. Consolidation, ultimately the purpose is to avoid multiplicity. And consolidation of suits is one thing which courts are regularly adhering to. Even in high courts, you will see if there is one writ petition, there might be 100 writ petitions. If they are same, then they will be brought on the same paragraph, consolidated with their attached. Similarly, in lower courts also, if the court feels that strict rigors of res judicata need not be applied, then the purpose, you are absolutely right and very finely pointed out. Because the purpose of res judicata is to avoid multiplicity, and to avoid conflict of law. So if you are able to avoid conflict of law by consolidating litigation, suppose a person has 4 kind of rights, and all those 4 rights have to be determined, and 4 separate suits have to be brought in. Then all those 4 rights, if they're between the same parties, they can be consolidated, so that both the parties can bring in their consolidated view. All 4 decrees can be separately passed. But at the same time, your questions, you very good question, because you again go to the genesis. Genesis is to avoid conflict of law.
Conflict of opinions.
Once you are having joinder of cause of action in the manner of consolidating the suits, it is a fine remedy. It is a fine remedy.
Yes, sir. So next question relates to res judicata. He wants to know whether the issue that has been directly and substantially an issue in a former suit, whether its suit means only a civil suit or any other proceedings between some other forum.
Now, this is important because there are, like, for example, I understand what you are trying to say. Suppose there might be revenue proceedings.
Yes, sir.
There might be tehsil proceedings. There might be another laws which may be proceeded against. But if some core reason is going on, some core adjudication is going on, then automatically, and if it is a competent jurisdiction, then again, my dear friend, we will have to go back to the same analogy and say that since since the specific remedy is there, therefore expressly barred, it will come into the nature of expressly barred. Moment you go to a revenue suit, we all know what revenue suit is and revenue courts are, or any other court. The moment you go there, and moment it is found to be in proper jurisdiction and found to be entertained there, it becomes expressly or impliedly barred here. So with that express and implied bar, automatically the suit shall have to be stopped, or shall have to be the proceeding has to go to its original place.
Original place. Yes. Next question relates to foreign judgments. The person wants to know almost all the matrimonial disputes are either disposed of in Indian country or in country they reside outside the country. So though the foreign courts may not have jurisdiction on personal law, if there is application of natural justice and the respondent has taken part of the proceeding, is it not binding on the local courts?
You are right. That is why I said that it should be adhering to natural justice. It should be within jurisdiction. It should not be against Indian policy, international policy. It should not be by fraud. And these parameters have been laid down in such a way the court will have to understand that if any flaw is there and it is not having jurisdiction, then it will not. Suppose, for example, let us directly go. A divorce petition has been filed in America by a couple. And the court which decides the divorce petition or grants the divorce is not having the competent jurisdiction. So the judgment will suffer from nullity there also. So the judgment which is suffering from nullity in that territory, US, London, Australia, New Zealand, wherever the couple is, if it is suffering from nullity in matrimonial laws in that country, if they are not accepting it, you are right, my dear friend, we can't be made to accept that. We will accept that only if it is adhering to their competent jurisdiction, adhering to their courts, adhering to natural justice. Then only we will say, yes, if you have a proper system, you have a proper adjudication, then we will accept it. Otherwise, if it is not applicable, if it is not available there, how we can do it here? You are right. You are right.
Next question and final question on the same foreign judgment. He wants to know whether an order passed by a foreign court in my absence without serving a sermon on me would be binding on Indian courts. Probably an offshoot of the same question.
Yes, but it is pertinent because these are the queries which have to now these days with globalization. These are problems which we as lawyers and law fraternity, as students of law, will ever face, and this will increase because we are a global community now. We know it that there are lakhs and lakhs of Indians who are there here and there, whether it is financial, matrimonial, or anything. We have to be very strong in our opinion. And as far as this question is concerned, it is again a very straight answer to it, that it is, if it is with the X party, it is not adhering to the parameters of natural justice, which is an important element of acceptance of that. If natural justice is not being, because the doctrine of audi alteram partem has a minimum requirement of opportunity of hearing. So if it is not served opportunity, if there is an X party, it is certainly will not be applicable here. And you will have all the chances to defend yourself against that such judgment.
Thank you, sir. There is one Mr. Ramesh who wants to talk with you, sir, for a question.
Definitely, please.
Mr. Ramesh, KP Ramesh.
May I please, Mullah? May I please, Mullah?
Yes, Ramesh. Yes, please.
Actually, in respect of civil suit, we cannot be decide and create the jurisdiction of the party. But in arbitration clause, whether it is available to decide to file the case about that jurisdiction, to file the suit.
Arbitration, again, you have to go to the arbitration where the jurisdiction will lie. Suppose two parties agree that if there is any dispute, we will have such and such as an arbitration and such place. Again, the language of the arbitration clause will be pertinent. Suppose two parties agree to the international arbitration. They go to the London Court of Arbitration. There is a rule of London Court of Arbitration, that is, there is a statute book there. Both the parties knowingly very well what will be the consequence, subject themselves to such arbitration. Then they are within the jurisdiction to do it. Arbitration, you can slightly create jurisdiction because arbitrator and arbitration place, both the parties to their mutual convenience, they can decide. Unlike CPC, where CPC you can take care of the convenience because if the company is selling, it will take care of its convenience. Normally, you will have all big companies saying subject to such and such jurisdiction, or all big institutions saying subject to such. In arbitration, it is between both the parties. So if they are able to do it, but suppose if it is silent, then again you have to fall back here.
Yes,
thank you.
Thank you, sir. All the questions are over. I should thank you wholeheartedly for the time and energy you have taken in taking as a webinar nearly 3,000 kilometers away from Chennai. And I'm very confident that the lecture was very meaningful, touching to the point and addressing the very basic questions of CPC. I think the younger members of the bar would have been very much gained. So once again, on behalf of myself and Hemalata, and I just want to thank you, Lordship, for the meaningful discussion and deliberation. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Manoj. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.